Pity the poor appendix, a 2 to 4 inch long worm-like pouch dangling from the head of the cecum, where the large and small intestines meet. For most of its medical history, anatomists have known about it for well over 5 centuries, it was maligned as a mysterious, vestigial, and seemingly useless organ that could only cause trouble if left to its own devices. Though unable to determine its function, doctors recognized that the appendix could become inflamed and cause serious illness and even death. And so more often than not, starting in the mid-18th century, when in doubt, surgeons took it out. The first successful appendectomy, on an 11-year-old boy whose appendix was punctured by a pin he swallowed, took place in London in 1735, followed 24 years later by the first appendectomy to treat appendicitis, in which the organ becomes infected. By the late 1800s, improvements in operative techniques and anesthesia rendered surgery the undisputed treatment of choice, and it has remained so even though British physicians, among others, found in the mid-1900s that patients given only antibiotics more often than not recovered without surgery. But the wheels of medical change can turn very slowly, and only now have researchers successfully demonstrated that nearly 2/3 of patients with an infected appendix that hasn't ruptured, so-called uncomplicated appendicitis, do as well as or better when treated with antibiotics than those who have the appendix surgically removed. The most definitive study of 530 patients with uncomplicated appendicitis was published in JAMA. Finnish researchers showed that appendicitis had not recurred 5 years later in 172 of the 257 patients randomly assigned to be treated with antibiotics. Of the 85 patients in the antibiotics group whose recurrent infections were then treated surgically, 7 turned out not to have appendicitis, and in only 2 had the appendix ruptured. Even though about 2 patients in 5 treated with antibiotics later required an operation, the advantages of a non-surgical approach for those who are spared a recurrence of appendicitis include avoiding potential complications from anesthesia and surgery, as well as avoiding a much longer recovery. Still, you may want to know, why keep this organ given that 7% of us will develop appendicitis during our lifetimes? The answer, my friends, is that the appendix is turning out to contain biologically useful tissue that may help prevent nasty gastrointestinal sickness. Now, just a century later, researchers have finally provided evidence contradicting long-standing medical dogma to remove the appendix not only when it's infected, but whenever surgery for some other reason renders it accessible. As it turns out, Heather F. Smith, an evolutionary biologist, and her colleagues at Midwestern University in Glendale, Arizona, have found convincing evidence that the appendix has apparently evolved independently more than 30 times in the course of mammalian evolution, suggesting that it provided some kind of adaptive advantage. The appendix, with its high concentration of lymphoid tissue, stimulates and supports the immune system, especially when pathogens invade the gastrointestinal tract, she explained. Furthermore, she suggested we could do a lot better to preserve the health-promoting potential of this tissue. Dr. Smith pointed out, although great apes and several other primates and rodents have an appendix, only humans get appendicitis, a condition that predominantly afflicts people in industrialized nations who consume a westernized high-carbohydrate, low-fiber diet that can result in calcified carbohydrate particles becoming entrapped in the opening to the appendix. Research at Duke University lends further support to the value of this useless vestige of evolution, as it was long considered. Dr. Ralph Randall Bollinger and his colleagues in the Department of Surgery at Duke described the presence of a biofilm of beneficial bacteria in the large bowel of humans, suggesting that the appendix is well suited as a safe house for bacteria that can repopulate the colon when its contents are purged following exposure to a pathogen. In other words, should you become afflicted with an illness that washes out the good bacteria normally found in a healthy colon, the appendix can serve as a repository of beneficial organisms to replace them. Although the incidence of appendicitis in Western countries is falling, more than 200,000 cases occur annually in the United States, making appendicitis the most common abdominal emergency. With this new information coming to light, it has become imperative that we make every effort to keep the appendix when the option comes to remove it, as it might be important later. Bye everyone.
This is Elon Musk.
Hey guys, what's up?